November 1st, 1857, All Saints' Day in Yazoo County, Mississippi. While church bells rang across the cotton fields and white families gathered for their holy feast, 9 overseers would meet their Maker in a way they never expected. Their blood would soak into the same soil they had watered with the tears of the enslaved. Their screams would pierce the autumn air like prayers finally answered, and the hand that delivered this terrible justice belonged to a man they had broken so many times, they forgot he could still cut. They called him Solomon, though that wasn't the name his mother whispered over his cradle before they sold her south. Solomon the healer, Solomon the wise, Solomon who knew which roots could cure and which could kill. On this All Saints' Day, he would become something else entirely, the dark angel of reckoning, moving through the quarters like death itself, settling debts written in scars across black backs. This is the story of how a man's soul can shatter and reform into something sharper than any blade, how memory becomes a weapon, how the harvest of cruelty, when it ripens, feeds only ravens. Before we continue with this tale of buried justice, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one need to be remembered, need to be told, need to echo through time until the dead can finally rest. The magnolia plantation sprawled across the Mississippi Delta like a beautiful cancer, its white columns gleaming in the autumn sun while its roots fed on human misery. On this All Saints' Day, the main house buzzed with preparation for the evening celebration. Crystal glasses caught the light on mahogany tables. Silver platters held roasted meats that slaves would never taste. The air was thick with the smell of honey ham and bourbon. Laughter spilling from windows like water from a broken dam. In the parlor, plantation owner Charles Whitmore raised his glass to toast another profitable year, his face flushed with wine and satisfaction. His wife, adorned in silk that cost more than most slaves would see in a lifetime, tittered at his jokes while their children played with imported toys. The overseers, those 9 demons dressed as gentlemen, had been invited to share in the feast, their pockets heavy with blood money, their consciences light as feathers. But if you walked past the quarters where the enslaved lived, the scene shifted like stepping from heaven into hell. Wooden shacks leaned against each other for support, their walls thin as paper, their floors bare dirt. Children with hollow eyes pressed their faces to cracks in the wood, watching the golden light from the big house like prisoners staring at freedom. The smell here was different: wood smoke, unwashed bodies, fear that had soaked into the very timber. In one of these shacks, Solomon sat motionless on his straw mattress, his fingers tracing the handle of a straight razor hidden beneath his pillow. Outside, the wind moved through the cotton like whispers of the dead, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang a song that sounded like crying. The night was coming, and with it, a reckoning 20 years in the making. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth knew that before dawn broke, 9 souls would be called to judgment, and the harvest of hate would finally be gathered in. Solomon had been born with hands that could heal, long, gentle fingers that could find the source of pain and draw it out like poison from a wound. His grandmother, before they sold her to pay a gambling debt, had taught him the old ways: which herbs could ease a fever, which roots could help a woman birth her child, which leaves could make a man sleep so deep he'd forget his troubles. She called it medicine. The overseers called it witchcraft. Solomon learned to call it survival. His first memory was not of his mother's face, they took her when he was barely walking, but of Overseer McKenna's boot crushing his hand as he reached for a dropped biscuit. "Nigger boy needs to learn his place," McKenna had laughed, grinding his heel until Solomon's small bones cracked like twigs. That was the first lesson in a lifetime of education about what it meant to be property. By 10, Solomon was working the fields from can see to can't see, his child's hands bleeding from the cotton bolls, his back already learning the kiss of the whip. But it was in the evenings, in the secret spaces between the work and the worry, that his real education began. Old Sarah, the plantation's herb woman, took him under her wing like a mother bird protecting her chick. She taught him that every plant had a purpose, every root a reason. God put medicine in the ground for his children. she'd whisper, showing him how to identify healing plants even in the darkness. He also put justice there, but that's a lesson for when you're older. The years taught him patience the way water teaches stone, slowly, relentlessly, wearing away everything soft until only the hardest part remained. He watched his friends sold away like cattle. He held dying men in his arms while overseers laughed at their pain. He saw women dragged from their beds in the night, heard their screams echoing across the quarters, and felt something in his chest grow cold and sharp as winter. Overseer Williams liked to use a cat o' nine tails with metal tips. Overseer Johnson preferred his fists and boots. Overseer Reed had a particular fondness for the wooden paddle with holes drilled through it. Said it cut through the air better, made a cleaner sound when it connected with flesh. Each of the 9 had their specialty, their signature cruelty, their particular way of reminding the enslaved that they were less than human. But Solomon was watching, always watching, learning their habits like a hunter studies his prey. McKenna drank himself stupid every Tuesday night. Williams couldn't see well in the dark without his spectacles. Johnson had a weak heart that made him wheeze when he walked too fast. They thought they were gods on earth, untouchable in their authority. They forgot that even gods can bleed. It was Sarah's death that finally broke something in Solomon's chest. Not broke it open, but broke it closed, sealed it shut like a tomb. She died on a winter morning when the frost painted the world white. Died because Overseer Thompson wouldn't let Solomon treat her fever with the medicines she'd taught him to make. "No nigger witchcraft on my watch," Thompson had declared, letting her burn up from the inside while Solomon knelt beside her bed, helpless for the first time in his adult life. As Sarah's breath rattled out of her like wind through dry leaves, her eyes found his in the dim morning light. "The roots know," she whispered, her voice barely a ghost of sound. "Ask them. They'll tell you which ones are for healing." Her hand, lighter than a bird's wing, touched his cheek. "And which ones are for justice?" That night Solomon began to plan, not with rage. Rage was too hot, too wild, too likely to get him killed before he could finish his work. He planned with the cold precision of winter itself, methodical as the turning of seasons, patient as the growing of trees. He studied each overseer like a scholar studies scripture, memorizing their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. He tested the sharpness of his grandmother's straight razor against thin strips of wood, practicing the angle and pressure needed to open a throat clean and quick. He gathered plants in the dark of the moon, roots that could make a man dizzy, leaves that could make him weak, bark that it could slow his heart to almost nothing. Most importantly, he waited. Waited for the right moment, the right night, when the stars aligned and the ancestors whispered their approval on the wind. All Saints' Day, when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, when justice could walk the earth with righteous footsteps. McKenna would be first, the one who'd crushed his child's hand all those years ago. Solomon had watched him for months, learned that he always made his rounds alone after the evening meal, checking the slave quarters with a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. But McKenna's pistol wouldn't help him against a blade that moved like memory itself, quick and silent as a prayer. Williams would be second, caught in the privy where he went to read his dirty books by candlelight, thinking himself safe in his private shame. Johnson third, stumbling home drunk from the overseer's quarters, his weak heart no match for the shock of Solomon's razor opening his throat like a second mouth. One by one, they would fall. 9 overseers who had turned human beings into beasts of burden, who had measured their worth in the weight of cotton picked and the silence of screams. 9 demons who had forgotten that even the meekest soul can sharpen itself on suffering until it cuts like truth itself. Solomon didn't sleep the night before All Saints' Day. He sat in his shack like a monk at prayer, his razor in his lap, his mind moving through the evening to come like a dancer rehearsing steps. Outside, the wind carried the scent of autumn, dying leaves and wood smoke, the sweet rot of things returning to the earth. Tomorrow he would add 9 more offerings to that harvest of endings. He thought of Sarah's words about roots and justice, and for the first time in 20 years, Solomon smiled. The feast in the big house stretched long into the evening, 9 overseers growing loose-tongued on Whitmo, Ree's whiskey, their laughter echoing across the plantation like the cawing of crows. Solomon moved through the darkness between the buildings like a shadow with purpose, his razor hidden in the folds of his shirt, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. The moon hung like a bone button in the black sky, casting just enough light to see by, not enough to be seen. McKenna came first, as Solomon knew he would. The man's routine was as predictable as sunrise. Evening rounds at 9 o'clock sharp, lanterns swinging in lazy arcs as he checked each slave cabin for anything that might threaten the natural order. Solomon waited behind the smokehouse, counting heartbeats until McKenna's boots crunched on the gravel path. When McKenna passed, Solomon stepped out of the shadows like death taking human form. One hand covered the overseer's mouth, the other drew the razor across his throat in a single, perfect arc. McKenna's eyes went wide with surprise, then dim with understanding, then empty as rain barrels. His blood was black in the moonlight, warm as summer rain on Solomon's hands. The lantern fell and shattered, oil spreading across the ground like liquid starlight. "That's for my hand," Solomon whispered to the dying man, "and for every hand you've broken since." Williams was washing himself in the basin behind his quarters when Solomon found him, the man's pale belly hanging over his belt like risen dough. Solomon's reflection appeared in the basin's water just before the razor opened Williams's throat, the man's blood mixing with the wash water until both ran red as wine down the wooden drain. Williams managed one gurgling sound before silence claimed him, his body folding into the basin like a prayer position. Johnson was stumbling drunk between the cotton gin and the main house, singing some half-remembered hymn about salvation when Solomon's blade found him. The man never even saw his killer, just felt the sudden coolness across his neck before his knees gave out and he fell into the cotton bowls he'd forced 1,000 hands to pick. His blood soaked into the white fiber like dye, turning it the color of sunset. One by one they fell. Reed caught by the corn crib, his paddle dropped in the dust beside him. Thompson surprised in the stable while checking on a sick horse, his body crumpling into the hay. Davies at the well where he'd forced countless slaves to draw water for his personal use, his blood mixing with the depths below. Each killing was swift, silent, precise. Solomon moved between them like a conductor leading an orchestra, his razor the baton that brought their symphony of cruelty to its final, perfect note. He felt no rage in those moments, no satisfaction. Only the cold completion of work that needed doing, justice delivered with the same mechanical precision they had used to deliver pain. Henderson died clutching his whiskey bottle, never knowing why the world suddenly tilted sideways. Parker fell while counting the day's cotton receipts, his ledger book drinking up his blood like thirsty paper. And finally, Morrison, cruel Morrison who liked to brand slaves for sport, met his end in the tool shed where he kept his implements of torture, his body falling across the very brands he'd used to mark human flesh as property. 9 overseers, 9 demons dressed as gentlemen, 9 lives ended with the same indifference they had shown to the lives they'd destroyed. Solomon stood in the moonlight afterward, his razor dripping, his clothes stained with righteous blood, and felt something in his chest that might have been peace if peace were possible for a man like him. The mockingbird that had been singing all evening fell silent. Even the insects stopped their chirping. The plantation held its breath, as if the earth itself was absorbing the weight of what had been done, drinking in the blood of the wicked like rain after a long drought. Solomon cleaned his razor on Morrison's shirt, folded it carefully, and walked back to his cabin. Tomorrow would bring discovery, investigation, arrest. Tonight belonged to the ancestors, to justice, to the settling of accounts that had been overdue for 20 years. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He sat on his straw mattress and waited for dawn, listening to the wind carry whispers of approval from every slave who had ever died under these men's whips, every child who had been sold away from their mothers, every woman who had been taken in the night. The harvest was complete, the blood was gathered in, and for the first time in his life, Solomon slept without dreams. Dawn came gray and cold, painting the plantation in shades of ash and bone. It was a housemaid who found McKenna first, his body sprawled near the broken lantern, his blood already thick as molasses in the morning chill. Her scream cut through the air like a blade, sharp enough to wake the dead, which in a way it did. One by one the bodies were discovered. Williams floating face down in his basin, Johnson tangled in the cotton bolls, Reed crumpled by the corn crib like a discarded scarecrow. Each discovery brought fresh screams, fresh panic, until the plantation buzzed with the chaos of a kicked anthill. Charles Whitmore stumbled from his house still drunk from the previous night's celebration, his face pale as his wife's china, when he saw what his morning had brought him. 9 overseers dead in a single night, their throats opened like prayer books, their blood painting the ground in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The surviving house slaves clustered in frightened groups, while the field hands maintained their usual silence, though something like satisfaction flickered in their eyes when they thought no one was looking. The sheriff arrived by noon, a fat man named Cromwell who sweated through his shirt despite the autumn chill. He walked from body to body with the air of a man already knowing he wouldn't find answers he wanted to hear. This wasn't random violence. This was precision, planning, purpose. Someone had methodically eliminated every overseer on the plantation in a single night, moving between them like smoke, killing with surgical efficiency. Solomon was working in the herb garden when they came for him, his hands black with soil, his face serene as a saint's. He didn't resist when Cromwell's deputies grabbed his arms, didn't protest when they found Sarah's straight razor beneath his mattress, the blade still stained with righteousness. He looked each white man in the eye with something that might have been pity, as if he understood something about justice that they never would. At the trial, held in the county courthouse with its tall windows and American flag, Solomon sat in the defendant's chair with his hands folded like a preacher at prayer. The prosecutor, a thin man named Augustine who'd grown rich defending slavery in court, painted Solomon as a monster, a savage who'd turned against his betters in a fit of animal rage. But when they asked Solomon to speak in his own defense, he stood slowly, his voice carrying across the packed cour, troom like wind through wheat fields. "You taught me," he said simply, his words falling into the silence like stones into deep water. "Every lesson I learned about killing, you taught me. Every skill I used that night, I learned watching you work. You showed me that some lives don't matter, that some people aren't really people at all. I was a good student." He paused, his eyes finding the faces of every white man in that room. "The only difference between you and me is that I chose my targets more carefully." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on 9 counts of murder. Sentence: death by hanging at dawn on November 15th. Solomon received the verdict with the same calm he'd shown throughout the trial, as if he'd known all along how this story would end. But knowledge and peace aren't the same thing, and Solomon had found something deeper than either in that courthouse. He'd found truth. November 15th dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning that makes breath visible and turns the world sharp as broken glass. A crowd gathered in the courthouse square to watch Solomon die, white faces hungry for the spectacle of justice, their kind of justice, the kind that restored the natural order and reminded everyone where they stood in God's plan. Solomon walked to the gallows with his head high, his hands bound behind his back, but his spirit free as a bird on the wing. The preacher offered him last rites, but Solomon declined with a shake of his head. "I've already made my peace," he said, his voice carrying across the square like a prayer. "Not with your God, but with mine." They placed the noose around his neck with the same care they might show a prize bull, adjusting the knot for maximum efficiency. The executioner asked if he had any final words, and Solomon looked out over the crowd of faces, some eager, some curious, some secretly sympathetic, and spoke his truth into the morning air. "I am not the first," he said, his voice steady as bedrock, "and I will not be the last. Every chain you forge makes the next man stronger. Every whip you raise teaches the next hand to strike. You can kill me, but you cannot kill the idea of me. I am every slave who ever looked at his master and wondered why God gave men such different colors but the same capacity for hatred." The trapdoor opened with a sound like thunder, and Solomon dropped into eternity. But his words lingered in the air like smoke, settling into the minds of every person present, white and black alike. Some would try to forget them. Others would carry them like seeds, planting them in conversations whispered in dark corners, letting them grow into stories, then legends, then something approaching truth. In the quarters that night, old women spoke his name in prayers. Young men sharpened knives and remembered his example. Children learned to count to 9 and understood that sometimes numbers could be prayers too. Solomon was dead, but Solomon was everywhere now, in every moment of defiance, every flash of rage, every time someone looked at injustice and decided it had lived long enough. He had become what every slave owner feared most, an idea with hands, a dream with a razor, a memory that refused to die. The wind carried his story south to Georgia, north to Tennessee, west to Arkansas and Texas. Overseers began sleeping with pistols under their pillows. Masters started checking the locks on their doors twice each night, the natural order so carefully maintained through generations of violence began to show hairline cracks, and in those cracks, something new began to grow. Here's what they don't teach you in history books: that violence births violence like rivers birth streams, that cruelty creates its own weather patterns, that every action spawns reactions like ripples spreading across still water. They'll tell you about the brave soldiers and noble causes, the presidents and the speeches, the dates and the battles, but they won't tell you about Solomon, about the thousands like him who decided that dignity was worth dying for, that some chains are meant to be broken with blood. What violence is buried under the sugar we sweeten our coffee with? Whose cries became the seasoning in our stews? How many Solomons lie forgotten in unmarked graves, their stories dissolved in time like salt in water? This is the history that hides behind the history, the truth that lives in the shadows of the truth we're comfortable acknowledging. Solomon's story isn't just about revenge. It's about the moment when a human soul refuses to be broken any longer, when survival becomes less important than self-respect, when a man decides he'd rather die on his feet than live on his knees. It's about the terrible mathematics of oppression. Push people far enough, hard enough, long enough, and eventually they push back. Every nation has blood in its foundation stones. Every fortune was built on someone's back. Every comfortable truth rests on a mountain of uncomfortable lies. Solomon's razor cut through more than flesh that All Saints' Day. It cut through the illusion that cruelty could continue forever without consequence, that power could persist without resistance, that human beings could be treated as property without someone, eventually, presenting the bill. If you enjoyed this story of buried justice, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. It really helps the channel keep bringing real stories that never make it into the history books, the stories of people who refused to be forgotten, who fought back with whatever weapons they could find, who proved that the human spirit cannot be owned, cannot be broken, cannot be killed. Because somewhere in the darkness, Solomon is still sharpening his razor, and the harvest of justice is never truly complete.